From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
On October 11th, 2022, the Church recognized the 60th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council by Pope John XXIII. To commemorate the Council and examine the mark it continues to have on the Church these 60 years later, the National Catholic Register published a symposium of voices. Senior Editor Jonathan Liedl helped organize this effort, and Theologian Larry Chapp contributed to the special edition. Both join us today to discuss Vatican II's continued relevance in this moment, as well as its significance for the future of the Church. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, Editor-in-Chief and Executive Director of the National Catholic Register, and your host here on Register Radio. As I said, we're looking at Vatican II at 60. So let's start with a few fast facts. The Council began October 11th, 1962. It was convoked by John XXIII and was concluded by Paul VI on December 8, 1965. The gathering produced 4 constitutions, 3 declarations, 9 decrees, and many years of debate. More than 2,000 bishops attended the 4 sessions, and thousands of advisors or observers, both lay and religious, were present, including Karl Wojtyla, who was the future Pope John Paul II, and Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. In 2015, the Register looked at the documents of the Council in a special symposium, and now we've looked at the relevance of the Council today. Jonathan Liedl led this effort for the Register, and Jonathan is with us now. He's a graduate of Notre Dame. He holds an MA in Catholic Studies from the University of St. Thomas and is currently completing an MA in Theology from St. Paul's Seminary in Minnesota as well. So Jonathan, I'm so grateful for the work that you did for the Register in putting together this special coverage. And now we turn to what has really been quite a debate in recent years over Vatican II. You'd think maybe things would subside by now. But when Saint, right, John XXIII opened the Second Vatican Council on that October day in 1962, he expressed a confident trust that, and I quote, "In the light of this council, the world would gain in spiritual riches and be enabled," quote again, "to face the future without fear." So, we know that the Vatican II has had an unquestionable impact on the Church over these years. Yet sometimes when you look at the debates that still go on today, you kind of wonder, how do you even define its impact, right? So today, in this moment, how do you describe this milestone and the tone and the atmosphere of this moment?
Yeah, it's funny, in your introduction, Jeanette, you mentioned the debates that kind of sprung up about the Second Vatican Council and its meaning, especially in the decades afterward. And it seems like many of those debates, which may have seemed settled for decades, are kind of upon us again. So I think when both our contributors to the symposium on Vatican II's 60th anniversary, but also the wider kind of Catholic audience and commentariat out there, it seems like this anniversary of Vatican II kind of brings with it maybe a little more uncertainty about what its legacy is, maybe a little more contention and even angst than we've seen in years past. And I think, just to compare, I wasn't working with the Register back in 2015 when we did that symposium, but just looking back on it, it was a very kind of tranquil symposium, right? The contributors were breaking down documents from the Council and just talking about their impact on them. And this year, I think a lot of our contributors really were aware of that kind of that legacy is uncertain and things seem a little unstable right now. And so they wanted to draw attention to that. So a couple pieces that spring to mind: Matthew Levering, who's the chair of theology at Mundelein Seminary, he wrote a piece, Vatican II at 60, The Crucial Question, and just really, drawing attention to that we, in order to interpret Vatican II and receive it fruitfully, we have to view it, right, through a Christocentric perspective. We can't view it as a kind of political power move, about rearranging the structures of the church. And he notes that those were some of the thoughts back in the day, in those decades after the council, but they seem to be resurgent now. So
That's
I think,
right.
it's
Jonathan,
kind
I'll
of
jump in for a second because one
sure.
of the lines that he calls this the crucial question, and he says that question is whether Vatican II was about worldly power or Christ's power. And obviously he believes it was indeed about Christ's power, but that's a stark way of putting it, in many question, how has worldly power crept in to the church these days? So very powerful piece there by Mr. Levering.
Absolutely, and I feel like it's something that in 2015 we didn't necessarily maybe need to ask ourselves, because it seemed clear, right, that Vatican II is not about worldly power. It's not about, how can we simply update the church to make it more relevant and worldly, right? But how can we take that ever ancient, ever new faith, but in a way that's attractive to people?
And of course, we have to look at the historical reasons for that. I mean, the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, both who attended the council, they really took to the task of laying out the council's teaching to the church as a continuum, right, of a hermeneutic, of a continuity, as Pope Benedict would always say. And so they did a lot of work to bring those teachings into the life of the church. Francis has a different style, and he himself has said that the legacy of Vatican II is unfulfilled. The work of Vatican II is unfulfilled. What do we know? I mean, do we know what he means by that?
I think this seems to be Pope Francis's style in general, right? He's always talking about encounter and dialogue. And I think you're right, how you laid it out. I mean, John Paul II, we can imagine, was chosen by his fellow cardinals precisely at a difficult time in the church, where it was kind of an open question of what Vatican II meant for the church going forward. And so his long pontificate, and then Benedict XVI, was really about establishing like an authoritative interpretation of it. And Francis's style, that style of kind of wider engagement that we see, seems to be leading him to bring voices back into the conversation that maybe were sort of recognized previously as not consistent with how the popes were viewing the council and its significance and its impact. So at the very least, we know that much, right? That the Pope seems to be motivated by including people in the conversation. We don't know. I think it's difficult to say if that means he rejects, what John Paul II and Benedict XVI have laid out before him. But there certainly is a sense in which, voices that, or even not just voices, but even entire ways of thinking about the council that previously kind of were seen to be unfruitful and went out of favor are resurfacing. We had on the anniversary of the council's opening back on Tuesday, October 11th, the Synod for Bishops, or Synod of Bishops, which is leading, the initiative, the Synod of Synodality. They released a kind of statement talking about the significance of Vatican II, and they characterized their mission as carrying out the spirit of Vatican II, which of course is a very, very loaded statement, a loaded way of interpreting the council. So the council, you don't look at the documents and what was actually said, but you try to discern sort of like the spirit of it, right? This need to be ever changing and ever adapting to the modern world. The theologian Massimo Fagioli pointed that out and said, hey, this is significant. We're seeing sort of the rehabilitation of a view that was closed down in previous decades. So
right, and that can be also characterized, Jonathan. One of the synod of and synodality, one recent tweet and a poster that was tweeted out, or a picture that was tweeted out of people hand in hand in front of a church, with a woman wearing priestly vestments and another with a rainbow flag, and that image itself is kind of promoted as church. is a visible picture of what's at play here and what is being promoted again, and was at one time off the table. I mean, the church has clarified these issues, but there's
Pope
still.
Francis, yeah. Well, I mean, Pope Francis himself has affirmed what John Paul II said in terms of the church's ability to ordain women. It's an impossibility. And so, Father Raymond D'Souza, a regular Register contributor, he wrote a piece for the symposium, kind of a play off the famous movie title called Backwardist to the Future. And he was getting at, the Pope has criticized those who he says display a kind of backwardist mentality, like wanting to go back in time to a bygone era and not accepting, the reforms of the church and the true sense in which the church does need to change to remain the same, which is, a principle of St. John Henry Newman in his development of doctrine. But Father D'Souza points out, that this backwardism, also can describe some of these voices and these agitations we're seeing to go back to the 1970s and to revisit a lot of, whether it's women's ordination, whether it's things related to human sexuality, whether it's, whether the church is a democracy where everything is decided by vote, or whether we have a deposit of faith, right, that it's the bishop's job to guide us through. So all these questions are kind of, in a way, at least, I wouldn't say they're back on the table in that, that real change will actually happen to them, but happen because of them. But they're at least in the air and they're at least being discussed. And I think that's contributing to this uncertainty about what Vatican II means, because people seem to be using it nowadays, as a pretext for advancing these kind of ideological agendas.
Jonathan, this symposium that you put together was quite rich. I mean, we had many interesting names. One, Cardinal Pell, writing about Gaudium et Spes and the Synod on Synodality. We have Tracy Rowland in a piece, When Vatican II Becomes Ancient History, and she remarks about and kind of laments that young people just don't even want to know about Vatican II. They sort of reject the name, and that's a danger. Stephen Bullivant wrote about atheism and Vatican II, a very interesting piece, something I had not thought about before. And then I find this very interesting, and I want to close on this thought. John Cavadini, and he wrote something on unfulfilled legacies. And I think here, as we talk about this sort of unsettled moment, I think John has maybe an intercessor in his piece for our future. So describe a little bit what John wrote about.
Yeah, well, exactly. John Cavadini, who is a theology professor at Notre Dame, he points out, we like to debate kind of these questions of what's the right hermeneutic to view the council, and what do the documents really say? And he points out, well, hey, yes, we need to do that, but there are also rich dimensions of what the council taught that when we've kind of been squabbling over the right way to look at it, we haven't really put them into play. And he points out to two. He talks about the study of Scripture, which Dave Verboom, which is the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, how it proposes how we can study Scripture fruitfully with the historical critical method, so bringing in some of these insights of kind of more secular approaches to texts, but then also to treat them as truly inspired, to treat them as Scripture. And he says there's a lot of work that continues to need to be done in that vein. That was also a concern of Benedict XVI. And then he talks about Mary. He talks about the Blessed Mother. Of course, there was discussion about whether there should be a document dedicated just to Mary and Marian theology, but the Council Fathers chose to incorporate it into Lumen Gentium. The last chapter on the dogmatic constitution of the Church ends with conversation about Mary. So he says there's just an immense amount of fruit that can still be reaped by contemplating how the mystery of the Church cannot be thought of really, or renewed or appreciated outside of the mystery of Mary. And really, I guess, Jeanette, the final thought on that point is, there's so much conversation in the Church right now, the Synod on Synodality or whatever it might be, where it really seems to just boil down to people fighting over power, right? Mm-hmm. Like people fighting over who gets to be in charge, who gets to decide what. And I think Dr. Cavadini's point is that if Mary is the image of the church, that's as far away from the way we should be thinking about being church and living church. Mary, of course, who, her fundamental response is that yes to God, that fiat and that receptivity. So apart from that, we really can't renew the church in the vision of Vatican II.
Right. So Our Lady's seat of wisdom, pray for us. So
yes, indeed.
Jonathan, I'm going to invite our listeners to go to ncregister.com and look at the banner at the top. There is a title, Vatican II at 60. Click on that and you'll find all of these commentaries that we've been talking about commemorating the Second Vatican Council 60 years later. This is Register Radio on EWTN. Stay tuned. We'll be joined in just a moment by Theologian Larry Chapp about continued coverage of the 60th anniversary of the Council.
Bishop James Conley talks about the National Catholic Register.
I've been reading the Register for over 40 years, and I can tell people with absolute conviction that it's the best periodical out there. They're honest, they're true, and they give a great perspective. It's important to be able to have a news source like the National Catholic Register where we can go to and make sense and decipher what's going on around us. It also engages the imagination. If you really want to be an informed Catholic, you got to read the National Catholic Register.
To get 6 free issues, order online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. That's ncregister.com/radio or 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. While you're waiting on your first issue, be sure to enjoy our content online. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register, and I'm joined by Register contributor Larry Chapp, who wrote a commentary on the liturgy for our Vatican II symposium. Larry received theology at the Sales University. He is author of many articles and books and is the founder and chief author of the blog GaudiumEtSpes22.com. He also, as I mentioned, writes for the Register, and we were happy to have him as a part of our symposium. You know, Pope Francis this week on October 11th had a mass at the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Council. And in that, he encouraged Catholics to leave behind criticism and anger and to live with faith and joy. And he kind of referred this to the Council itself and some discussions that continue to take place that he said are characterized by grumbling and criticizing. And he said, for those of us who love the church, we need to do everything without murmuring. Well, Larry, I mean, we have a lot of murmuring in the church today, related to Vatican II, but also related to the liturgy. And this isn't new to this day. Liturgy has been a lightning rod ever since the Second Vatican Council closed. You know, it just became a place, unfortunately, of contention. And you wrote about this in your piece. So help us to understand what Vatican II actually set out to do related to the liturgy.
Yeah, well, this is a church of murmurings today, and with all due respect to the Holy Father, those murmurings are going to continue. The horses are out of that barn, fortunately or unfortunately. But anyway, the Vatican Council, we have to remember that before the Council, of course, was the Latin Mass, the Old Latin Mass. And I support the continued presence of the Latin Mass in the contemporary church. Nevertheless, it has to be kept in context and non-romanticized that the pre-Vatican II liturgy in most parishes was very often performed quite poorly, with priests just sort of mumbling their way, mispronouncing the Latin, mixing it all together. Many parishes did not have Gregorian chant choirs, that sort of thing. So modern traditionalists go to these traditional Latin masses and they see these great and glorious masses being done. That's all well and good, but that was not the norm. And many, many Catholics, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but it was true, would just sit at Mass and pray their rosaries, do private devotions, that kind of thing. And so the council, to answer your question, was seeking to redress that and to update the liturgy so that the faithful were not simply observers, but were active participants in the liturgy as such. And so it opened the door towards the Mass in the common language of the people. It opened the door to the priest saying the prayers out loud. It opened the door to the congregation responding. A lot of modern Catholics who don't remember the old Mass are not aware that, the average layperson in the pew never said anything at Mass. There were no responses, really, of any kind. We just take it for granted now. So the council wanted to achieve what they called active participation in the liturgy, and so it commissioned a reform of the liturgy. Now, whether or not the liturgy that we got is exactly the liturgy that the Council Fathers had in mind is a separate question. I tend to think that the liturgy we got was not exactly what the Council Fathers had in mind, but nevertheless, that's a debate for a different day. We're talking about Vatican II and what it really sought. It sought the reform of the old liturgy in continuity with that liturgy to increase the active participation of the laity.
And you see some ways that it really got this. And in your column, you describe two different liturgies that you've participated in your life as a Catholic. One long ago, it was 1977, and another much more recently. These, and you can describe them here, but these two liturgies, both, you write, have worthy fruits, even though they're very different.
Sure. The fact of the matter is that there's this common complaint out there today from some traditionalists that the new liturgy is incapable of advancing a reverent, transcendent, mystical encounter at Mass. It's incapable of truly fostering the faith. A lot of heated rhetoric in that direction against the new liturgy. But I remember when I was at the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska in 1977, at the heyday of the liturgical renewal. I mean, it was a very Orthodox parish, very Orthodox priest, Diocese of Lincoln, very Orthodox diocese. But the Mass was the new Mass, and it was guitars and St. Louis Jesuits and just about everything that we make fun of these days. And yet the place was brimming with faithful students on fire with the faith. In other words, that liturgy did sustain a profound evangelical faith life there in that parish. And that's true to this day across the globe. It is simply not true that the new liturgy cannot produce communities of faith. It does so all over places in Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America. It does. So I think far too often the new liturgy gets a bum rap from traditionalists in that regard, and my own experience bears that up. And then a few weeks ago, I was in Baltimore giving a talk at the old cathedral, Basilica of the Assumption. And before Archbishop Lori was there, before my talk, there was Vespers. It was sung with a beautiful schola in English. It was in English. It was the new prayers of the new breviary, but it was stunningly beautiful. Some of the most beautiful Vespers I've ever seen. Giving the lie, once again, to this idea that, well, unless the prayers are in Latin, I guess God doesn't hear them, or it can't be beautiful, or it can't be transcendent. This is just patent nonsense. It's part of an ideological package of defamation against the newer form of the liturgy that I think is actually kind of regrettable.
What I loved about your column and another column that you wrote about holiness and the universal call to holiness, which directly relates, of course, to the Vatican II's dogmatic constitution, Lumen Gentium.
Right.
Both of these columns that you wrote, one on the liturgy and one on holiness, really helps to present a way forward. I mean, we are at a moment of murmuring. We're a moment where, if you want to say there are two sides, that both sides need to have the humility to recognize what the other side is putting forward and to come together in some way for a solution. How is your second column there on holiness really an antidote to this moment?
Well, I think it's absolutely key to the Council's whole project. Right there in the middle of Lumen Gentium, Constitution of the Church, the Church is in a sense attacking clericalization of holiness that had sort of set in, the idea that only the celibates who are in religious life, male or female, nuns or priests, only they can truly achieve holiness. The rest of us poor slobs in the laity, we just have to sort of muck around, trying our best to follow the commandments, but it's going to be really hard for us to achieve holiness. And the council sought to really go after that idea and to emphasize that all are called to holiness, of course, according to your vocation and station in life, but still we are all called to holiness. And it is the antidote to the problems of today, because really, truly, one of the things that happened after the council that in many ways derailed this message of the call to holiness was this attempt to clericalize the laity in terms of, tons and tons of Eucharistic ministers, lay lectors. And I'm not necessarily against those things, but the point is that's not what the main conciliar focus was in terms of getting the laity more involved in the church. It was more about reminding the laity that the Sermon on the Mount is not meant for the elect, it's not meant for the perfect. It is meant for every single human being. And if we started as a laity, what we need, as Dorothy Day said, is a revolution of the heart in the laity. We could ignite, as her co-worker Peter Morin said, the dynamite of the church, if the laity were to rise up and really go through, I guess what we'd call in the old days, a kind of revival. What we need is a laity revival. What I sometimes say, we need a discalced laity, like the religious orders that reformed, that, now we're discalced, meaning we don't wear shoes as a sign of our poverty. We need a kind of discalced laity in the sense of a more intentional and rigorous form of life and living in the church.
Larry, I couldn't agree with you more, and your piece titled, What does the universal call to holiness look like today, actually answers that question with something very powerful. It talks about parents living holiness in the home and how we pass on that faith, that example of faith, to our children. I encourage all of our listeners to go to ncregister.com, look for Vatican II at 60, and you can find all of these commentaries that we've been talking about on this show. Remember, there's a lot more news, analysis, and commentary at the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks for joining us on Register Radio here on EWTN. For my producer, Jeff Burson, and for myself, Jeanette DeMelo, I pray that you will have a great week and that God bless you.